Can you
Boker,
hear?
oh, Boker, or everybody. I'm Jane Susswine, president of the Kaplan Center, and delighted. We've been waiting for this. This is such an appropriate and meaningful topic. We've been looking forward to this for a long time. We have two wonderful experts on Judaism and the environment, and I will turn the introductions over to our executive director, Elisheva Salama.
Both either. Thank you so much, Jane. You know, one of my first introductions to Judaism as a child, although I'm sure it was earlier, was my parents, who insisted that we go outside and plant flowers. And that was, I think it was really my mother who was the big impetus for it, that she would make us look at all of the other gardens around our home and decide what we liked, what we didn't like. She knew the natural history of plants. She really worked very, very hard to connect us to the environment, my brother and I. And that has remained with me as such an important thing, that in order to be part of this world in its fullness and its glory, of course, we have to look out and see what there is around us. And a lot of that is the natural world, of course. There's also people. But that we then have the responsibility from the book of Bereshit, but also from our own moral compass, to take care of that world and to enhance it, to create something that is beautiful and something that we can share as a legacy with generations to follow. And so every Tu B'Shvat, we always had very special celebrations in my family, and this feels like it's really an extension of that. It's not just the nasturtiums growing in the ivy around the corner, but it's also how we take the philosophy that guides us and turn it into something that will, in fact, create transformation in the world. So I am really, really privileged to probably not introduce most of you, but to share the screen with amazing workers in the environment in different ways, Rabbi Fred Dobb and Rabbi Michael Cohen, who each and separately have brought awareness of what it means to look at that outside world, to gather information about it, to act in ways that are protective and enhancing of it, and then to make that into a spiritual imperative. And so with that, and they really, neither of them need much introduction from me. They're both, if you haven't heard either of them speak before, you will get now the amazingness of what they bring to the world. So please, let us start with our first question, which is really, how is it that the Kaplanian imperative to create redemption through, or salvation through care of the environment, has inspired your work and your life?
Okay.
So Fred, yes, if you would start for us.
Great. All right. Hello, everyone. Delighted to see so many folks. I'm going to share a screen in a moment and then won't see you or see the chat, but thrilled to be on this with you all and with dear friends, teachers, classmates, etc. here. Happy Tu B'Shvat, almost, and I hope that we are feeling the rhythms of the world around us, the natural rhythms wherever we are, knowing the sap is rising, even as everything looks dead. And I'll say, coming from Washington, D.C., that metaphor rings really true right now, that we need to pray that the sap is indeed rising, and we are rising with it. But that's in a sense channeling Kaplan himself with really addressing issues of the day, staking out an unapologetically progressive stance, but never fashionably in the orthodoxy of the left, always with a unique spin. And I think that's a piece of the Kaplanian legacy writ large that I just wanted to open with. So I'm going to cover the waterfront a little bit because I have had an evolving presentation of kind of Kaplan and Reconstructionism, much of it indebted to the likes of Mel and Eric and others on this call. So you'll recognize some of that in there. Should be quicker by now with this after all those years, but here comes share screen, and you will recognize, I believe, this guy's face. Okay. So my single favorite Kaplan quote is, and again, Mel or Eric may be able to put a finer point on this, but that roots us in the grand scheme, was actually in the introduction to the 1945 Siddur that was so widely admired and widely panned and even burned in public. But the notion here is to link us not only to what became known in the late 70s as the Gaia hypothesis, something that sounded metaphysical but was actually grounded in atmospheric chemistry and cutting-edge science, but also in the larger notion behind it of interdependence. So he/they wrote, each of us should learn to think of ourselves as though we were a cell in some living organism, which in a sense, we actually are, in our relation to the universe or cosmos. The world is more than nature. It is nature with a soul. That soul is God. So I love this quote at so many levels, right? For it centers nature while adding divinity. Right. And we'll see in a moment that that's been a thought of his for a long time. So centering nature, because that's what we experience, and we experience it as a miracle. And our tradition uses the language of miracle for the everyday, of course. In the penultimate stanza of the Amidah, Al Nisecha Shebechol Yom Imanu. Thank you for the miracles, your miracles, which are with us every day. So the quotidian is the holy, and creation is evidence of the inherent value and the inherent sanctity of what is around us and of our interdependent whole, which requires us sometimes to step up and take different or corrective actions. There's also this notion of the profound interdependence. You think of a cell, a semi-permeable membrane is what constitutes a cell. It can survive on its own sometimes in proper host conditions, separated from its larger organism for quite some time. It feels independent, and yet, unless there's the right amount of exchange with the outside to take new in and get old out, it will quickly die. And the notion that we are each cells, we stand on our own, and yet we are powerfully part of community. And you can go further with concentric circles that starts with self, and a cell might first be part of a lining. The lining turns out to be part of a liver. The liver turns out to be part of a person. And a person turns out to be part of a community, who is part of a people, who is part of a species, who is part of the interdependent web of creation. So this guides my work. This is my work, or hashkafa, you might say, my outlook. And I am so thrilled to find it so deeply rooted in our tradition. Mel had shared with us some of us a few days ago, this wonderful quote from the diary, which we can come back to. I'm not sure if Michael was going to address it a bit later, but this is already 1904, saying, right, think of it, he's only 23 years old at this point, right? And writing long before any of his published works that we need to think about the relationship of nature and Torah, contrasting biblical with later notions, and kind of celebrating the biblical, the psalmist's notion of it, and concluding the laws given to nature are therefore greater than those given to humanity. And Mel added, very characteristically, Kaplan finds the roots of a respect for nature in the Torah. You might call it ecology, long before it was fashionable. He also notes very significantly that Kaplan uses the term reconstruction with a capital R. This is 1904, 16 years before the book that we usually use as credit for the source of our denomination's name. So with that, a quick run through. Theology is a big piece of the Kaplanian legacy that guides my work, but there's a whole lot more where that came from. There's community, this notion of interconnectedness that we looked at. I often use the analogy of the roots of mushrooms, of the mycelium, which in some cases can span acres and be among the largest single organisms in the natural world. Each little mushroom pops up for a brief period of time and seems to the untrained eye atomistic on its own. And yet it is deeply rooted in the rest of the world. And it does good for the palate when severed from the whole, but it really springs from the whole. And that's an imperfect, but I find useful analogy for Kaplan's teachings around peoplehood. So there's this notion of the importance of our group, while at the same time, the universal values, rejecting all hierarchies. No one people or species is chosen. And that is a vitally important notion that we need to extend into the natural world and into our relationship with it. There's the metaphor of evolution. He, of course, intentionally borrows that core biological, ecological metaphor in the famous phrase, the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. And I think of Eitz Chaim Hi, particularly in the week of Tu B'Shvat, the idea of, trees grow, but the species that are trees evolve, and it's kind of all neatly connects. That is the real chokhmah, the real wisdom, which of course is the antecedent of it in the original version in Proverbs of the line we use to close the Torah service, Eitz Chaim Hi. Torah is a tree of life. Really, it's wisdom. And of course, for us, wisdom and Torah are almost interchangeable. And for many of us, wisdom, Torah, and Kaplan are almost interchangeable as well. Taking the long view. I'm starting to now get a little broader in how I define the influence. Kaplan was a big picture thinker, a synthesizer of disciplines. And we see that in how he uses this civilizational model. And I'm particularly taken with Pope Francis's language from Laudato Si, the papal encyclical that turns 10 this year, intergenerational solidarity, right? Or as we might say it, L'Dor Vador is more than a slogan. It's actually a call to action. So taking the long view, the big picture. Shita, this notion of a method in the 1956 book that the last webinar focused on, questions Jews ask. Elisheva's and my teacher, Rabbi Nancy Fuchs-Kramer, highlighted the passage from somewhere around page 78, if I recall. In response to a questioner, Reconstructionism is a method more than a series of affirmations, and goes on even to say the things that we think of as core Kaplanian theology are simply a way of viewing this, one that he personally finds compelling, revealing, and comforting. So I take inspiration from Kaplan without feeling beholden to all of the details. And I see in his teaching and his modeling the need to ever integrate justice with sustainability, that we take the narrow and the broad and we keep them yoked together. That's his shita, his method. And in our day, in our case, society and ecology need to remain linked as well. And in particular, justice with sustainability, the need to center the experience of marginalized communities, the frontline and fence line communities that bear the greatest of pollution and climate change's brunt, that we need to keep this constant focus on environmental racism, climate justice, as we do the larger work. And more broadly, his Shita insisted on grappling with mythic truths and selectively applying their lessons to our challenges. He wrote so beautifully about the Exodus being the heart of our story, because liberation is not just about us, it's about all peoples. That was a pretty radical move to make in the days that he wrote. Now, liberation theology needs to include the liberation of other species as well, just as for him it extended to the liberation of other peoples. That's taking his notions and writings and bringing them to the next level. I'll say more about Musar later, but I think there's something important there. And then writ large, the movement itself and what it has contributed. I left number 9 open to imply in the Q&A, let's keep this going, and numbers 9 and far beyond. And eventually the classic notion that we absolutely have to do and go, tzeh v'avod, the right turning around the tzeh ulmad of Hillel's answer to the interlocutor. Since we're on this webinar studying, then the end has to be that. So in the last, hopefully, of my 10 minutes, a very quick word about this, the number 8 about the movement. So it's here in case I go too quickly, wanted to be able to say it clearly and quickly. And this may not be universally shared, but I do believe that as Kaplan was focused for most of his career on ideas over institutions, and yet with changing circumstances, and specifically slow to change denominations of his day, and with help from Manny Goldsmith, Zichrono Livracha, we just honored his first yahrzeit, and Ira Eisenstein, etc., he evolved. And now we have a unique set of neo-Kaplanian institutional voices, varyingly so, to be sure. But in a sense, the Reconstructionist movement is the next step of that. And I do believe it's helpful to remain deeply engaged with it. Yes, the 20th century denominational structures are at some level a dinosaur in our day. And certainly, few will ever fully and always agree with their own denomination. I love Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, modern Orthodox teaching. I don't care what denomination you're affiliated with as long as you're embarrassed by it. So how can we remain embarrassed by it? Because that's how coalitions go. And yet say that for as long as denominations persist, one that has these values and this history in its DNA should be a vital part of that mix. And I do believe, beyond theory or theology, this is really about collective impact and power. For example, powerful Reconstructing Judaism and Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association resolutions just in the past few years that go much further than that of what our Reform and Conservative cousins are saying about ambitious eco-action at every level, individual and communal, all the way to national and global. There's still a place for that. So I'm honored to be simultaneously active with the institutions of the Reconstructionist movement and with the Kaplan Center, and I hope that most of us will do the same for these reasons. So the very final piece is to note this analogy between people and peoples in a social system and species, biodiversity in an ecosystem. Kaplan, more than anyone, I believe, married deep universalistic outlook and global truth and a full and respectful celebration of what makes each people unique and irreplaceable and holy with a profound focus and set of insights that stand on our own. He did that by honoring others while centering the Jewish experience and insisting that we use language, even in prayer. Asher Kervanu La'avodato, the one who has drawn us near to divine service, is something that we say in Hebrew and celebrate that, but can be said in Sanskrit or Arabic or Greek and sound just as good. All right? So Kaplan's legacy includes this notion of collective anava, or humility, on behalf of a people. So let's now extend his chiddush to humility on behalf of all people. And I'll say more about that when we get to Musar, and I am honored to be in this conversation and look forward to my friend Michael's observations.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Fred. That is just beautiful framing for us. And the mushroom image is going to show up in some of my thinking as time goes on. Reverend Michael, would you like to share your understanding of Kaplanian salvation and the environment?
Thank you, Elisheva, and thank you and Jane for organizing this. And it is an honor to be on this webinar with Fred and also so many friends out there on the screen as well. You are small on the screen, but large in my life. So I think we'd be remiss if, when, at least often when I talk about Reconstructionism as an evolving religious civilization, I think that Tu B'Shvat is like one of the great examples we have. It starts as a fiscal holiday in the Torah, demarcating when a tree is 3 years old and when it can be tithed. And then by the time we get to the 16th century, Rabbi Isaac Luria rediscovers Tu B'Shvat as a mystical holiday as he wrestles with the theology of how could the Jews have been expelled from Spain, and comes up with this radical theology of his Lurianic Kabbalah that the world was made imperfect, and our task is to tikkun, to repair it. And as part of that, he reinvents what the Seder is and creates the Tu B'Shvat Seder. And so we find an evolutionary jump in Tu B'Shvat from a tax date to a radical, mystical, theological holiday. The Zionists, of course, rediscover Tu B'Shvat as the connection to the land, which one can argue is one of the reasons we remained a people, was maintaining that connection to the land no matter where we are. We also note that and Tu B'Shvat represents revival at this time of year of winter, as Fred alluded to. And so it was intentional that the Technion was established on Tu B'Shvat and in 1925, and that the first Knesset met on Tu B'Shvat in 1949. And so it gets reinvented. It's part of this evolution of the holiday. It's what we do as our civilization. And then finally, post Earth Day and the secular environmental movement, if you will, Tu B'Shvat has been rediscovered as the Jewish environmental holiday par excellence. And the Tu B'Shvat has been revived as an environmental holiday. Ellen Bernstein of blessed memory was, one of the main forces behind that in Philadelphia when a number of us were actually there in the 1980s. And so I think we need to remember that Tu B'Shvat is a great example of the Kaplanian understanding of Judaism evolving. And I do want to say this in terms of evolution and evolving, that, and this is related to how we approach the environment in many things, is that science, of which is often how we understand the environment, but clearly we have a theological, spiritual aspect here as well. Science is also always evolving. You know, we talk about it's scientifically proven. That only means at a particular moment in time, this is how science understands something. And we go with that, knowing it may just be disproved, as Einstein did with Newton, and as Einstein will be disproved. But we need to understand that science also evolves. It's often presented as being like, that's the truth. Well, it's not, just like Judaism. And so I think we need to understand that evolutionary nature. And as Fred alluded to too, without evolution, the environment in us, we would not be here today. And so that underpinning of evolution that's so critical to Kaplan is applicable to the environment in so many different aspects of our lives. The other aspect in terms of talking about Kaplan and the environment is that for Kaplan, as Fred also alluded to, nature is where we can discover divinity. Nature is one of the addresses, perhaps the address. There's a wonderful quote from The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion, where Kaplan says, despite the emphasis upon the manifestation of God in history, Jewish religion would not have its adherents forget that God is also manifest in nature. And that's where he would go to find his connection to God, and invites us to do that as well. He also writes his wonderful commentary in Kol HaNeshama on page 9, a commentary to Yedid Nefesh. Our yearning for salvation, which is what we're talking about here, is the human form of the will to live, which is cosmic and characteristic of all living beings. In our case, the will to live is the will to abundant and harmonious living. Human nature is part of the larger world of nature, and our salvation can only be conceived as a manifestation of a divine power both within and beyond us. And again, it's not only that the holiness in God is found within nature, but there's not a separation, if you will, between us and the environment and nature as well. When I was in rabbinical at RRC, I ran the bookstore, so I had to could get up into the attic where all these things were stored. And we used to print years ago these little pamphlets, I think in the 60s. And one is called The 10 Commandments Today, a Reconstructionist pamphlet by Mordechai Kaplan. And it's this wonderful commentary that he has on the 10 Commandments, Aseret Brot, or the 10 sayings. And on the second, where it says, you shall have no other gods besides me, he writes the following. The unity of God, or monotheism, applies that all things that exist do not constitute a multiverse, but a universe. And that the universe is so constituted that by conforming to that which is a universe, particularly the cosmic polarity of independence and interdependence, people and nations can achieve fulfillment or salvation of their total nature. And we use the word universe all the time. We really don't think about it. Uni, it's one, it's all connected, it's all interconnected with clear implications of how we should understand our relationship to the environment. One of the things that I do when I teach my class on the Bible and the environment, I present, I think, to make the argument that the text is also talking about a biocentric understanding of the environment, that we are not separate from it. And I think this commentary by Kaplan on the second commandment of the 10 Commandments clearly understands that. And you can extrapolate from him saying that to having this biocentric orientation when it comes to the environment. And finally, what I want to close with here, this Kaplanian piece, is we have to go to our Torah, Judaism as a civilization. And even as early as there on page 444, Kaplan writes, In the light of those explanations, the function of the Sabbath is to provide humans from engaging in work which in any way alters the environment, so that they should not delude ourselves into the belief that we are a complete master of our destiny. That part of the goal of Shabbat, of all those rules, is not to alter the environment. And if you look at you look at what we're not supposed to do in Shabbat, from that list in the Mishnah, most of them are taking things from the environment and changing them. And on Shabbat, we don't do that. And Kaplan understands that. And part of, in essence, Shabbat, 1/7 of the year, then if you have the holidays, even more so, 1/7 of the year, we're told to leave the environment alone. This reminds us of the holiness of the environment. And related, we talk about what we're not supposed to do on Shabbat, those 39 activities. But those 39 activities were used during the week to build the Mishkan, to build the dwelling place for God within our lives. And we sometimes forget that part of the message. It's telling us the other 6 days, we have to cultivate and build a place so God can be within our lives. And as we've seen, Kaplan understood that, and the Jewish tradition understands that the address for much of that is in nature and the environment. And so therefore, part of our task is to preserve and protect, increase, take care of the environment, which is a holy task, being also the address for God. That's my Kaplan influence for now.
Lovely. Thank you so much. Thank you. That was great, both of you. So I'd like to now move us from the divine and the heart to the work of the hands, and sort of your more intimate responses to how you take what you've each taught us and create it within the world. So again, we'll start with Fred. I know you have to speak about Kaplan and Musar and us. So if you would give us some of your insights, please.
Thank you. Wow, yay! I'm going to listen to the recording and get Michael's wisdom again. So Kaplan simultaneously missed the boat and caught it, right? Kind of like Schrodinger's cat, right? He came up with a system that absolutely centers ethics and absolutely is spiritual in its own way, and that is completely overlapping with psychology and with sort of the emerging disciplines, right? The whole shtick about, he was learning before sociology, anthropology, and psychology were fully differentiated. He was there learning from the greats of all of them on Morningside Heights in those early formative years. And all of that is Musar. And as we know, he wrote his doctoral thesis on Luzzatto and published this very important English translation of Mesilat Yesharim. But it wouldn't be until generations later that other liberal Jews would look at that, and in particular Rabbi Ira Stone, who in the introduction to his annotated Mesilat Yesharim, it notes that Kaplan came so tantalizingly close to creating a whole system of Judaism that would center these principles of look deeply inside yourself and think about your one attribute at a time and work on them in focused and very move the needleable ways, and effect positive change through this approach to Torah. And yet, Kaplan couldn't quite get over the hurdle of of his own teachings of transvaluing, right? The way that many of us read traditional texts and just apply the Kaplanian notion of transvalue, right? When someone else presents an old theology, we just have a little pop-up box that occurs by when the cursor of the mind hovers over, right? Avinu Malkeinu or whatever, and up pops, oh, the sum total of the animating forces that are forever making unity out of chaos, etc., and all of our favorite Kaplanian notions, life, love, and intelligence of the universe. And he didn't, but we can. So when Elisheva asked us to get personal, for me, the personal is Musar. It's where we begin to crack ourselves open, and do the inner work that will lead us there. Rabbi Manny, again, this is just past his first yahrzeit, Emmanuel Goldsmith, very important leader in our movement and very important figure for many of us on here, none more so than Dawn, but many of us. One of the last really salient conversations that I had with him visiting when his mind was going, but far from gone, that amazing mind. And I said, I should have asked this in your prime, but, I've fallen in love with Musar. What do you think about how your teacher, Kaplan, and the early Hasidim felt about it? And he said, it's all Musar. Everything is Musar, right? Ethics at its core, and went into the whole God and good by adding the extra O, right? I mean, so much of what he stood for. But I just want to introduce that voice that there is something there. And I'm attracted to Musar because it makes a difference personally, but I'm also attracted to it because I think it's a really effective way to move us around environment, the things where we have the space between, right, the cognitive dissonance between what we know and what we are striving to do. And I imagine if we do an honest gut check, a Musar exercise, right? How many things in 10 seconds can you identify where you are not living out all your principles when it comes to ecology? I keep saying as a lacto-ovo vegetarian that when I do more musar, I'll be a vegan, right? Because there's nothing but yetzer hara. There's nothing but convenience and price and availability and personal yumminess. Ben and Jerry's, right? That there's otherwise no good argument for the current dairy industry, and eggs are too expensive anyway, right? But for not just the chickens and the cows, but for the global poor and for our own great-grandchildren, right? The carbon footprint of what we eat is one of the great areas. Most of us fly way more in the upper middle classes than what we know is sustainable. And yet we have good reasons, but those good reasons are often the yetzer hara speaking. So this Musar approach that Kaplan led us to the precipice of, now for me as a neo-Kaplanian, I will embrace it alongside others. So there's so many teachings in Musar that are exemplary, and so many midot that fit the bill. I've been teaching this and will continue to. So is Rabbi Laura Bellows, a new covenant winner, etc. So you'll hear more about it. And the one that to wrap up earlier, this notion of humility, right? What does it mean to take anava and turn it from me as an individual in a community of people to humanity as a species among all others? Two Tel Aviv University researchers published in already 2018, noting that the full biomass of all living vertebrates on Earth is 96% either people or the cattle that we are raising. Only 4% of the biomass of all living vertebrates is truly the wild. Only 4% left. We are taking up too much space. Anava calls us back, and Kaplan can provide much of the inspiration for doing so.
Wow, that was a particularly scary figure. I do know that one of the great differences between now and the Middle Ages is the number of birds that there were in the sky on a daily basis. The sky could, in fact, turn black, and it is not anymore. Thank you so much, Fred. Michael, would you care to?
That's hard to follow, but I'll do my best. Thank you, Fred. That was deep as always. So let me start with, as a child, I grew up in Ewing, New Jersey, between Princeton and Trenton. Nothing great to write about, except that's where Washington marched on his way to the Battle of Trenton. But there was this woods behind our house, and I was there every weekend, and I would write letters to the governor of New Jersey if I saw pollution, in the creek when I was like 10 years old. In high school, a senior in 75, 76, the dark ages, I helped establish the first recycling center in Ewing, New Jersey. And I mention all of that because one of the reasons why I became a rabbi is I wanted to keep doing what I was doing, but with a Jewish cloak, if you will. And it was my father who actually suggested that I look at RC. He was a history professor and loved the approach. And I got there and loved it as well as all the other things that the movement and Kaplan stands for. So I just kind of want to put that out there. In terms of how I try to walk the talk of Kaplan and salvation when it comes to the environment, I'll say two things, one little thing and one I'll go deeper into. So I try to, walk the talk as much as possible. Well, it's covered in snow now, but I've tried to get rid of my front lawn. One of the worst things we do as a culture in America is our lawns. We cut them too short. We fertilize them too much. I could go on and on and on. And so I've gotten rid of most of my front lawn and have replaced it with perennial flowers. And it's a great thing. And my mother-in-law, Libby Hill, does it in Evanston, Illinois, in the great suburbia. So it can really be done all over the place. And maybe that would be a great initiative for the Reconstructionist movement to get synagogues and houses of worship and people to turn their lawns into perennial gardens. So I throw that out there. So as many of you may know, a lot of where I have put my work and my energy is with the Aravai Institute for Environmental Studies. It takes Kaplanian's value of shalom, of, I would argue, the best of what Zionism can be, taking care of the environment in one little address. I was fortunate to be part of the founding faculty there in 1996. It's located on Kibbutz Keturah in the south of Israel. We just got back 2 months ago from being there for 15 months. The goal of the Institute is to train a cadre of environmental leaders from the region. So our student body is often made up of Israelis, Palestinians, Jordanians, Moroccans, and international students, including from the United States. If you have children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews who are looking for an amazing experience, I can't recommend it enough. And just to give you a framework of where the world has gone backwards, in that first year, in winter of 96, 97, Rabbi Michael Cohen, I went to Gaza to do student recruitment. And we had students from Gaza those early years. We've actually had students of Gaza until 2 years ago. And it just shows you how much we have just gone further apart and why our work is even more difficult, but I would argue even more valuable, both in terms of the crisis between Israelis and Palestinians and the crisis that the house is on fire. And so I get to deal with a lot of those passions and issues there that are clearly Kaplanian in orientation. We have an undergraduate program where students take courses in various aspects of the environment. Ideally, our student body is 1/3 Israeli Arab, 1/3 Arab meaning Israeli Arab, Palestinian, Jordanian, etc. 1/3 Israeli Jewish, and then 1/3 the rest of the world. it doesn't always reach that balance, particularly in days that we're in right now. We also have an internship program for after people have done their bachelor's, they can come and do an internship with us. We put on our green glasses and we do environmental touring of the region so people see it from a very different light. And then we have something called the Dialogue Project, which is where students are in a safe place where they can say and hear some of the hardest things they need to say and need to hear. We don't push any issues under the rugs at all. In terms of the environment, we have a number of transboundary research centers, the Center for Climate Change Policy and Research, the Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Conservation, our Center for Sustainable Agriculture, Transboundary Water Management, the Joint Israel Center for Community, Environment, and Research, which are run by an Israeli and a Jordanian alum of the program. And part of the proof of the pudding for us is what they do when they leave and how they continue to work together. We have an alumni association where they're constantly in touch and have conferences. Our executive director is a Palestinian, Dr. Tarek Abu Hamid, which speaks in volumes about what we're able to do in terms of that. We have a Center for Transboundary Water Management because so much of the issues of the region are of the Middle East. And we established a few years ago our Center for Environmental Diplomacy that on the grassroots level, of which we are part of along the other 160 organizations of the Alliance for Middle East Peace, there's a lot of amazing work being done between Israelis and Palestinians. It doesn't get the attention because of the asymmetry of the sensational, which I can certainly talk about a little bit later. But we had this chutzpahdik idea years ago that we could maybe teach the track one diplomats success. So we began this center, and actually Dennis Ross, the kind of classic track one diplomat, was invited to our second conference, and he said, wow, I missed something here. And he's been writing about this ever since. He says that in the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, Israeli-Jordanian camp in Oslo, they forgot about the grassroots. And he's doing these mea culpas. And so he's kind of given us his hechsher in terms of we can then go to track one in government and say, this is how you do it, because we have much more flexibility. There is for example, a wastewater treatment plant just north of Ramallah, in El Bireh. The water is supposed to go down into the Jordan Valley to Palestinian farmers, but it has to go through Area C, run more or less by the Israelis. The Israeli government, the Palestinians, no one could agree on it. But because we had connections with all of them, we negotiated the agreement so the water can flow. And that's the flexibility that we have on the grassroots level. Our more recent initiative is something called Jumpstarting Hope Gaza, whereas, Gaza is just devastated right now. And we are bringing in, working with our Palestinian partners, bringing in off-grid, decentralized energy and water applications for the refugee centers that are being built there now. But that's the short-term goal. But the long-term goal is to model that when Gaza is rebuilt, to think about the climate as well, because it's so easy to get caught in the immediacy of this conflict, and we need to deal with it. But, we're here for remembering Tu B'Shvat that the climate is in crisis, and there will be an opportunity actually in Gaza to rebuild it much more environmentally sound, and in some ways become a model for that region as well. And so we're deep involved in that. And I'll put in the chat some links to some of the things I said. So I'll leave it there for right now, and happy to answer questions later on.
Super. Thank you so much. There's always this really complicated balance, and I think that both of you have brought this to the fore between like your own personal work, whether that's getting rid of the lawn or contemplating how you can make less of an imprint on the world, and the work that you do to change greater systems, like making sure water keeps flowing or planting congregational vegetable gardens that then feed the poor. And so I'd like to ask both of you to sort of reflect on how you manage that balance, because I think we all struggle with that. Anybody can jump in. Yes.
Can I speak? I just want to put Kaplan a little bit in perspective. He comes by Musar very legitimately His father, when I interviewed him in 1972, he referred to his father as a Musernik, and told me that his father received smicha from Scherlinder. And Kaplan lived at home until he was 28, and so the influence of his father was enormous. His father had a sense that Kaplan was drifting away, and he hired a teacher by the name of Stosnitz to teach Kaplan Moed Nevuchim in the hope that he would come back. But Stosnitz had other things on his mind, and very amazingly, he was part of a movement which attempted to reconcile Darwin and Judaism. The period of the beginning of the century, they were all obsessed with Darwin, and the way we sort of take Freud for granted, they took Darwin, and the whole idea of evolution was very important. And Sosnitz wrote a book. He taught Kaplan. He was meeting with Kaplan a couple of times a week, and he wrote this book called Achen Yesh Elohim, which is an attempt to reconcile Darwin and the Torah. So I think in terms of that kind of reconciliation and Musar, which was so important, that Kaplan has his roots really in the environment, and which precedes James and precedes functionalism, I think.
Phenomenal. Thank you so much, Mel.
Okay.
So
very quick.
Yeah.
Sorry. So just very quickly, the idea of balancing tikkun olam and tikkun atzmi. There was a whole journal of the Reconstructionist a good decade or two ago devoted to this, and Elishevez and my classmate and friend Toba Spitzer had an article in there that I wanted to look up and reread in advance of this. But those amazing perspectives are out there. I also wanted to just celebrate 1937, The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion. It was the first Kaplan book that I read cover to cover, cramming it the night before my interview, because that's how it went in our early 20s. And I've been taken ever since by that interplay. Every single holiday, he introduces simultaneously something from the narrow, if you will, from the Jewish experience, and something from the broad, from the collective universal experience, how these holidays are rooted in the natural cycle. And of course, disproportionately, as an originally indigenous tradition, the growing seasons of the land of Israel, and our Siddur also reflects those of Babylon as the archetypal diaspora existence. So we have this notion of where we are rooted in the larger while holding on to the individual. And I think that im ein ani li mili, like we have to stand for ourselves. Uchsha'ani la'atzmi ma'ani, right? This is, of course, Hillel in Pirkei Avot with that, the balancing act. If I'm only for myself, then what am I? I'm not even human. That is the core balancing act. There's no easy way of naming it, except that we need to do that with, as I was saying before, humanity and the rest of the earth, and keeping that in mind, also the balance of self and other. I want to enjoy good things for myself, but I also want to watch my carbon footprint. And I want to have my free time, but I also have to spend time organizing and trying to make a difference in the public square in defense of all that we hold holy.
Yofi. Michael, do you want to
Sure. I mean,
give us
I
your
think
technology for this conundrum?
sure, it is a conundrum. Life is a conundrum.
Yes.
Tikkun Atzmi begins by, 3 times a day we say Slach Lanu. Art Green and Dan Chemis, our blessed memory, would remind us, well, it's not to instill guilt in us. It's like 3 times a day we check in, do a serious check-in, and then you move on. We realize we're imperfect. So I think we need to do that tikkun of ourselves, but also have chesed at the same time, but not let ourselves off the hook and let us know it's an ongoing process. Its connection, at least, to tikkun olam when it comes to the environment. I read earlier that wonderful parish of Kaplan on the second commandment, talking about the interdependence and the independence of everything. If I can quote from that other great rabbi, Martin Luther King, at his graduation talk at Oberlin, which if you've never read it, you have to read the whole thing, but I'm just going to read a few sentences. All I'm saying is simply this, that all humankind is tied together, all life is interrelated, and we're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until what I am who I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. And I think if we take that, again, pull it even further in terms of the environment, that relationship that he's talking about between humans is also applicable to our relationship with the environment. And that when I repair or try to repair the environment, on some level, I'm also repairing myself and all of us. And so that's also where kind of that interplay takes place as well. That's all.
Fabulous. We had one more question that we were going to ask, and I'm conscious also of people's time and that people may have questions themselves. Maybe you can give us a minute each on this one. It's like, what should I do? I'm coming out of this webinar. I'm so inspired by what you both have to say. Where can I go to make a difference? How would you advise us?
In terms of my work, I posted a link to the Arava Institute and our work in Gaza, and an example of one of our amazing alumni, Farid, is doing it with a Bedouin village in the northern Negev. So send us students, your nieces, nephews, cousins, grandchildren. You can financially support us in the cuts that the U.S. government is making to USAID, and I'd be very happy to talk about that later on. We need help in pushing back to that. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Yofi. Fred?
I would add, in the Jewish environmental sphere, the two largest groups are dayenu.org, doing amazing climate advocacy, and adama.org, doing programmatic and educational work and moving toward the advocacy space. And in the multi-faith world, there's the fabulous network Interfaith Power and Light, which unfortunately the national is not as strong as it once was, but the state regional affiliates in many places very strong, are a fantastic way of joining together, where you show up as a Jew, but and motivated by these teachings, and yet you want to take advantage of the utility rebates and influence your local congressperson and figure out how to rewild your own garden or that of the synagogue in your bioregion, which, as I noted in the chat, already exists through the National Wildlife Federation's Sacred Grounds Initiative. These are all places to go. So I'll put those links in the chat as well.
Super. Thank you. I think it's a wonderful time to open this up for questions. If anybody has a particular something or question they want to ask of one of our presenters. Elizabeth.
Thank you. It was absolutely a remarkable webinar. I could not have asked for anything more targeted to what is in my heart and on my mind most days. So first, maybe a reflection on, Fred, what you said about, if I got it right, Kaplan Reconstructionism being a methodology, a method. And I did graduate work in ecology in very early 70s. So I was one of the first in Brussels University to take that track. And I remember arguing and writing about how ecology is also a methodology more than a science. Because it's really how you look at the world around you, including for industrial pollutions and things that are really man-made. And by the way, in the 70s, it was established that human activities were already moving more material than all the natural processes together. And as you were talking, I checked. Now there are articles and research establishing that it's about 10 times more important than the amount of material that is moved by nature. So we are going backward, and it's time to really take that seriously. The second thing is, later in life, I came to Judaism and Musar. So now I have a Musar practice and a Vad. And Jane will remember that how I became involved with Kaplan Center is by asking her, where is the Kaplanian Musar curriculum? Still looking for one.
Let's write it together. And amen to your observation about ecology is already, it's the branch of science that is most holistic. Right. So, of course, because Kaplan is represents the branch of Judaism that is most holistic. So that's kind of a meta way of talking about these parallels. And yes, through a Kaplanian lens, I'm trying to not be partisan here, but we can never not be political. Right. The prophetic is channeled very much in Kaplan and in Reconstructionist thought, that we are going backwards, and future generations will pay for even 4 years of backsliding. But as many things as are lost now, there are many more yet to be saved, and we have to keep hope, roll up our sleeves, and work together to, as a group of women with a wonderful website and book by this name, All We Can Save. Right, that we need to now do everything we can for all that we can save.
Thank you.
Anybody else with a question? So if not, I'm going to take a little rabbinic liberty and push us ahead a couple of holidays. I hope you are all familiar with this book, because in it is one of the really great illustrations of salvation. You've got here the tree that is also the bush that is burning, but it's not burning. And at the bottom is the bread of affliction that is the bread of freedom. And I think, especially after listening to the two of you tonight, we so live in that tension between seeing the presence of God in everything, having the tree of life available to us, and having the tree of life inaccessible to us because we aren't allowing ourselves to see it fully. And needing to go out into the desert, needing to get the statistics, needing to do the musar, needing to send our children off to build peace in different ways, in order to be able to really eat fully of that bread that is the bread that sustains us and that will eventually sustain the entire world, that it is nothing, it is only flour and water, just the very basics. But with that, a whole nation is created. And in the extension of that whole nation, so responsibility for all becomes created. And so we remember this tree and this bread every time we open our Siddurim, every time we take into our mouths the song of the sea that was sung by our spiritual ancestors, that there is nothing like the presence of the divine, and there is nothing like our responsibility to care for the gifts that we have all been given. And I see that Rabbi Joan has got her hand raised.
I do, even though this is a related. Can you hear me all right? I'm not sure.
Yes.
I just wanted to know that I'm working on disability rights and the rights of the elderly and the ill, and have been doing research on this and worked on a recent Shabbaton. And so much of what you said today, what has been said today, applies to the work that I'm doing as well. And so I intend to use some of this in applying to what I'm doing. So just thought I'd mention that.
And thus we light the fire in each other's hearts. So if we have no more questions or thoughts, I want to thank you all so much for coming, for sharing this time with us. I want to thank especially Rabbi Fred and Rabbi Michael for being so willing to give us such inspiration. I wish I could track all of us for the next 6 months and see how this has transformed our lives collectively, but I know it will transform mine, and look forward to hearing everything from you. I also want to acknowledge Sheridan, who is our amazing admin here at the Kaplan Center, who set up a lot of the underpinnings of this meeting. We will be sending you out a copy of the webinar. Please feel free to share it far and wide. This is information that is absolutely essential for everybody to hear. And we will continue with another webinar, fabulous webinar about Kaplan and about his relationship with his daughter and with what it means to be fully human, given by Rabbi Liz Bolton, and that will be towards the end of March. So you will all get a notification about that later. And then I will just end by, oh, your hand is up. Yes, Reb Michael.
Yes, I alluded to something earlier, and I really want to get it in terms of the cuts to USAID. That, it's kind of this broad thing out there where, the president first said, we're going to do a 90-day pause, we're going to review all this stuff. And then we've been working with USAID, pretty much since the Institute opened. If it wasn't for USAID, we probably would not be where we are today. We may have collapsed in the early years. And then very quickly, it was very clear that they were going to dismantle it. There was no going to be any review process at all. People who have their lives abroad are being sent home. It is cruel. But beyond that, in terms of us, we are going to lose $1.29 million of U.S. aid. That's going to affect our scholarships, our cross-border water, energy, and food cooperation initiatives, our farmer training, our transboundary wheat research, and of course for Palestinian Israelis to be held in Cyprus. We'll weather it. We're going to have to make up this 1.29. Smaller organizations that are just getting started where Israelis and Palestinians are working together will be decimated by this, and they will close. And I can't urge everybody here enough to urge your members of Congress, both in the House and the Senate, that the minimal that needs to happen, besides lawsuits which are starting, is that Secretary of State Marco Rubio needs to be called before Congress and ask very, very serious questions about what he's doing, what he said he's doing, but what he's really doing. So I'll leave it at that. I'll go on.
Excellent. Yeah, that's wonderful opportunities for tikkun olam abound. And so I do wanted to just conclude by also recognizing the tremendous efforts that our esteemed leader, Jane Susswine, puts into making all of Kaplan Center's offerings wonderful, accessible, and dynamic. If you want to know more and you haven't yet found it, the website is full of very fascinating things. And I look forward to welcoming you and your friends and your grandchildren and your interfaith connections to future webinars. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you. Such a blessing to be associated with all of you.
Absolutely. So Darba, absolutely
Good night.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. This has been a wonderful program.
Fred and Rabbi Mike.